Hi, my name is Jason Brenninger, and I'm the host of the Press Rewind Prince Lyrics podcast. It's a podcast entirely dedicated to discussing and dissecting the words that came from Prince's mind and mouth, his lyrics. If you're a regular viewer of Prince's Friend, you might remember me from the Prince's Friend off last spring. I won, just saying. Or, probably less so, my ultra-brief cameo in his Emancipation video review a few years back. So why am I here in this video? As someone whose entire show concept is to talk about lyrics, I wanted to share my thoughts on Prince's lyrics covering the first decade of his career, 1978 to 1988. After 3 years discussing and dissecting Prince's lyrics, my show has managed to work through songs off of his debut, For You, all the way to 1988's Lovesexy. So I'm kind of at a nice stopping point right now to discuss basically the first 10 years of Prince's career. There's a lot of music there. So what have I learned? What have I learned by doing this podcast over the last 3 years? Well, one thing I've learned is I think Prince is an underrated lyricist. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to do the show in the first place, to highlight an aspect of Prince's creativity and his talent that I thought was fairly underrated, wasn't talked about too often. And, that I'm talking about the words, I'm talking about the lyrics to his songs, the messages. His guitar chops, his ability to create a funky groove, his pop songwriting sensibilities, these were all aspects of Prince's talent that had been discussed quite a bit and celebrated quite a bit, but I don't think his lyrics have received the same amount of attention. So that was what my podcast was intended to sort of clear up or rectify. So the first decade of Prince's career is filled with lyrics that explore topics such as love, sex, freedom of expression, spirituality even in there, especially later on in this first decade of his career. So, he sometimes wrote songs about the state of the world, what was around him at the time, topics that were important to him at the time, sometimes even deep, meaningful dives into his own psyche. So, with this video, I wanted to showcase 5 examples of songwriting or lyrical techniques that Prince employed during this first decade. These examples really help us as the listener know him a little better, help explain what kind of an artist he was then and would become in the future. So the first, number 5, the first songwriting technique that I kind of picked up on was more prevalent in the early parts of his career, like the first half of the decade, his first decade. So on his very first song, on his very first album, For You, he declares, "With love, sincerity, and deepest care, my life with you I share." So here Prince lays the groundwork on whatever expectations we might have as listeners of his music. You want to know more about me? Listen to my music. That's in essence what he's saying. I'll tell you everything you need to know. Or maybe more specifically, I'll tell you everything I want you to know. That's, I think, a pretty important distinction to make. Prince was, he could be elusive at times with the media. He shared with us what he felt like sharing. That's basically, anybody can say that. Unless you're an oversharer, most of us share with people that we don't know, and he didn't know us. He didn't know his listeners personally. We share with them what we want them to know. And with his music at this time, he could be cryptic, intentionally so, or maybe intentionally misleading. He valued privacy, he valued freedom of expression, so it's like a mixture of that. Like, I want to express myself, but I also value my own privacy, so I kind of have to build a little bit of a mystique around myself. As far as the songwriting technique of being, of talking about and expressing who he was through his music, yes, that certainly lasted throughout his entire career. It wasn't just the first decade, or even like the first half of the first decade. But there are certain examples that I wanted to point out, like, for example, Uptown on Dirty Mind gave us a glimpse of who he was and what he valued at that time. Free from 1999, that's a pretty personal song, and it doesn't deal with relationships necessarily like a lot of his more personal songs did. Some other good examples, I think, and these examples maybe point to other songwriting techniques that he employed in this first decade, but I'll cite them here anyway. God gave us a glimpse into who he was as, a spiritual person, the B-side to Purple Rain. When Doves Cry was intended to also kind of be, in some ways, autobiographical. Obviously, it wasn't entirely, and there was certainly some embellishments to help fit the narrative of the film Purple Rain. We all know this at this point, but in 1984, a lot of people thought this was basically an autobiography film, and this was an autobiographical song. And I don't think that was an accident. Songs like Forever in My Life were very forthcoming from Sign of the Times. Forever in My Life was a forthcoming song about his relationships, and also not just with women or a specific woman, but also potentially with God. So these are examples that I wanted to cite of songs or songwriting techniques where Prince was trying to tell us who he was, and that was my number 5. Fourth kind of songwriting technique that I wanted to highlight here is one that I call Prince as the Enigma. So Prince also, as much as he wanted to share, like as forthcoming as he claimed he would be on those lines, and for you, for love, sincerity, and deepest care, my life with you I share. Yes and no. So in a song like Controversy, that's most famously known for its questions, unanswered questions. Do I believe in God? Do I believe in me? For example, Prince was courting controversy here by asking questions that were being likely already asked about him, either overtly or behind the scenes. So was he black or was he white? Was he straight or was he gay? These are the types of questions that, he wouldn't answer explicitly in the song Controversy, but, listening to his music and paying attention to who he was and what he was talking about would eventually give us the answers that we needed. So it kind of goes back to the number 5 point that I made about Prince is like the open book, but he's doing it through music. But in Controversy, he was an enigma, and oftentimes he maintained that enigmatic status in his music, especially early in his career. So I think what he was trying to do here was create a buzz around him, spark discussion. Anytime somebody's talking about you, that's a good thing when you're an up-and-coming artist, whether or not it was always positive, sometimes negative, I assume as well, but he was on people's minds. His name was being courted out there as somebody, an innovator, somebody who is doing something unique in the realm of music. These are questions that listeners had listening to his music. So, like, what kind of stuff was he trying to say in songs like Sister or Head? This is the persona he was presenting to us, the listeners, and to the masses in general. Shocking stuff, and also later on, Darling Nikki to a lesser extent. It's much less shocking of a song than Sister, for example, but still, the audience was wider, the reach was longer, so it made sense that a song like Darling Nikki would spark more controversy than a song like Sister did, a few years prior. And creating this buzz about himself was a shrewd act of self-promotion. It was something that I think he felt like he needed to do in order to separate himself from the pack. Also, just part of who Prince was, as being a unique individual with a unique point of view and a unique creative vision for himself and for his music. Eventually, he stopped being coy, so his status as an enigmatic writer would always be there, but I think less so as he got older. His background, his family history, his race, all of this was, as I mentioned, answered in his music at some point. And the occasional interview that he would give too during this time frame. So he was a stereotype smasher, and he was doing that by questioning society norms on what men could wear, what they could say, how they could act. His stage attire was proof positive of that during the Dirty Mind and Controversy era. I change the rules and do what I want to do. That's a line from Let's Pretend We're Married that definitely speaks to, Prince as the rule breaker as well. But then he follows that line up in that same song. I'm in love with God because he's the only way. And this is a good segue into my number 3, which is going to be talking a bit more about Prince as the spiritual advisor. So by 1988's Lovesexy, Prince's spirituality was on display very overtly in songs like I Know, Anesthesia, and the title track Lovesexy. But it didn't start that way. He was cloaking his thoughts on religion, on spirituality, and God in metaphors on songs like Let's Go Crazy and I Would Die For You from, the biggest album of his career, Purple Rain. But even by the next album, on songs like The Ladder and Temptation, I felt like he was getting more comfortable expressing this part of his belief system. By 1987's The Cross from Sign of the Times, he was putting it out there. He was pulling no punches. And on 1988's Lovesexy, Anesthesia, the line, love is God, God is love, boys and girls love God above, that really clarified and cemented, I think, in a lot of people's minds. Like Prince was had a lot of spirituality within him. He wanted to get that out and wanted to express that, and wanted his listeners to know a little bit more about, his beliefs, his ideologies, and making sure that we understood that he believed in God. And Lovesexy was that declaration, but it was an evolution. It didn't start out that way. He wasn't really speaking a lot about spirituality and religion in the first few albums of his career. It took about 1999, Purple Rain, before he really started putting it out there, and then more overtly on Sign of the Times and Lovesexy, of course. So that brings me up to number 2. Another aspect of Prince's songwriting that I thought was really interesting during this first decade of his career was his ability to diversify his creativity. And he did this by creating alter egos. Jamie Starr is one of the more famous ones that he created around this time. This was his alter ego, his songwriting and production alter ego for music that would mostly be associated with the time. But he incorporated this alter ego elsewhere. I think there's certain songs on the Families album from 1985 that certainly have that Jamie Starr feel to it. High Fashion, for example. That's a Jamie Starr song through and through, just sung by Paul Peterson instead of Morris Day or Prince as Jamie Starr. But, he also had a side of his personality, the yin to his yang. That is more like expression of his female side. So Prince was very smart and shrewd songwriter when it came to this. I think he knew that writing songs and singing them from a woman's perspective, using the Prince name, maybe wasn't a great way to cross over or gain a wide audience. There was a lot of closed-mindedness back then, not that there isn't today. But, he had his proxies, and that's where Vanity 6 came through. That's where Apollonia 6, Sheila E., Jill Jones, even, again, The Family with Susanna Melvoin as a member of The Family. He was able to do that as well. And he continued to write for women throughout his career. Mavis Staples is a great example, Patti LaBelle. So his ability to write songs from different perspectives and different angles, whether it was Jamie Starr or whether it was Camille. He was writing those songs for himself and to be performed by himself, but using an alter ego and a pitched up voice. So it kind of came across as somebody else, like that was the intent. He didn't have so many female proteges anymore. Vanity 6, Apollonia 6 were gone by the time he was creating Camille songs. And one thing that I like about this is even though sometimes he gave songs to others or gave an alter ego, sometimes he kept them for himself. A song that he intended for someone else. Pay attention to the lyrics like I had to in the course of these past few years doing this podcast. One example of that, one notable example of that would be the song 17 Days, the B-side to When Doves Cry. So in this song, there's a line. There's a line in this song that goes, "All I've got is 2 cigarettes and this broken heart of mine." And Prince is singing this. It's a Prince and the Revolution track. Prince didn't smoke. We all knew that he didn't smoke. And by all accounts, anecdotes, biographies written about Prince, he really had a disdain for the smell of cigarette smoke. He had band members at the Revolution at the time that smoked, and he wasn't a fan. Let's put it that way. So for us to believe that he wrote a song intended for himself to sing that paints him as a smoker just didn't add up, right? It doesn't add up. Knowing this, you can kind of conclude and connect the dots that this was a song intended for somebody else. And the most likely person this was intended for would have been Vanity 6, Apollonia 6 band member Brenda Bennett. She was a smoker at the time, and a lot of the promotional materials that were put out there, album covers, liner notes, things like that. In Purple Rain, you see Brenda smoking. So, yeah, that's kind of the assumption made that this was a song intended for Brenda to sing either solo or as a member of one of those 2 acts that she was in. But Prince reclaimed it, didn't change the lyrics because it's a great line. Why change it? But you know that wasn't meant for himself to sing. And that's one of my favorite aspects of Prince's songwriting in that first decade of his career is his ability to write for others and separate himself in a way that maybe some lesser songwriters are unable to do. To put aside Prince and write from the perspective of a woman, write from the perspective of, a pimp or somebody completely different. So finally, I think Prince was a master at writing songs from the point of view of a jilted lover. This is something that he did more so, I feel like, in his first decade of his career than he did later on. Yeah, he had heartbreak songs later on in his career. Girl That Done Me Wrong type songs later on in his career. But the first handful of albums from, Dirty Mind, Prince, Dirty Mind, Controversy, 1999, Purple Rain, there's just more of them. There's just the volume of them are greater. And I think he's really brilliant at mining these painful emotions and creating compelling musical statements based off of heartbreak, based off of pain, and in the expression of that heartbreak and pain in songs like It's Gonna Be Lonely from Prince. When You Were Mine is a great example on Dirty Mind. 1999 is filled with them. He's got songs like Something in the Water, Automatic. The B-side, Irresistible Bitch, is a great example of a song where Prince is taking on the perspective of somebody who's been jilted, somebody who's been treated poorly by his significant other, his girlfriend. Purple Rain, you can say that Darling Nikki might fit into this, but I don't know if it does, because I think his character in that song kind of likes being used in that way, so I don't feel like he's really been treated wrong there. He's been treated in a way that he had to come to grips with, but at the end of the day, I don't think he's too heartbroken or too tore up about it. Beautiful Ones, of course, is a very heartfelt ballad with a lot of pain and anger associated with it. So that's one notable example. Condition of the Heart is a very sad, heartbreak-filled song as well, from Around the World in a Day. So these songs, they become less and less as the decade goes on, the first decade of his career goes on. If I Was Your Girlfriend might be the last example of that, and even that is borderline. So really, I think the 1999 era, plus or minus a year, is where Prince was peak Girl Done Me Wrong, Woe Was Me type songwriting. But I love a lot of those songs, and that's why I put it number 1, because I think he really does a wonderful job of expression of heartbreak and pain in a way that makes you feel for the protagonist, feel for his character in the song. He does a great job of using words to kind of highlight some of the anger and resentment that he feels without coming across like he's being whiny or emotionally abusive. So I just appreciate that, and I think that's points to a very kind of young man's insecurities and he was a pretty young man at the time that these songs were written. So it makes more sense that these are songs that he would write and record early on in his career before he blew up, before, these types of concerns about relationships that would last or not last, or girls that would love him and leave him. I think that this is something that was done more early on in his career because it was just more of a reality of his life, potentially, and it was fresher in his mind, as it would be decades later when he had been a superstar for so long. It's kind of hard to probably, as a listener, to feel for somebody who has all this fame and all this adoration and think, woe is me. It's just harder for us to suspend disbelief. So that brings me to the end of my video on Prince's 5 key takeaways of his songwriting techniques in the first decade of his career. A couple of tropes that I didn't mention that are big ones and I think would almost deserve their own video sometime would be, Prince as the sexually voracious songwriter. This is a trope that Prince is most known for, I think, especially in the first decade of his career again, but it's certainly extended beyond that. The 90s are filled with very sexual songs, maybe less explicit, but still very sexual, still very erotic. And also the lover man Prince, the one that started with Do Me Baby and moved all the way to Batman's Scandalous and everything in between, that you could kind of point to as being a very, a Prince-esque ballad. Those types of songs also kind of deserve their own discussion. I left those 2 out. I thought they were maybe too obvious or certainly deserved a little bit more discussion. So, thanks to everyone for watching this video. You can check out the Press Rewind Prince Lyrics podcast. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on any of your podcast catchers, Apple, Spotify, Amazon. And if you enjoy the show, I would love to hear from you. And if you've never heard it before, I hope you would check it out. And thanks to Prince's friend for allowing me to be a part of his program. And also thanks to him for participating in my podcast episodes periodically as well. His input is always valuable to me as a podcaster. And thanks again. Peace.